The harsh wind whipped across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory, as Bethany Sullivan stared at her broken wagon wheel with a mixture of despair and exhaustion. The summer sun of 1875 beating down mercilessly upon her already sunburned shoulders. Hours had passed since her last drop of water, and the unrelenting heat had drained what little strength she had left, her vision beginning to blur as she sank to her knees beside the weathered wagon that carried all she owned in the world. Bethany had been traveling for weeks, fleeing the memories of a life that no longer existed, her husband's grave in Kansas now far behind her. At 24, she had imagined a different future, one filled with children and laughter, not this desperate journey into an unknown wilderness. Her throat felt like sandpaper as she tried to call for help, but no sound emerged. The empty canteen mocked her as it rolled from her trembling fingers. As consciousness began to slip away, Bethany thought she heard hoofbeats, but dismissed it as a hallucination, another cruel trick of the relentless sun. Her last sensation was of rough, dry earth against her cheek as she collapsed fully, the world fading to darkness around her. Jake Reynolds had been tracking a small herd of Mustangs when he spotted the lone wagon in the distance. Years of living in these territories had taught him to be cautious, but something about the stillness of the scene ahead troubled him. Urging his paint stallion forward, he approached with one hand resting on his holstered Colt. "Hello there," he called out, but received no answer. As he drew closer, he saw her, a woman's form crumpled on the ground beside a wagon with a broken wheel. Jake dismounted quickly, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. He knelt beside her, noting her flushed skin and parched lips. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked, gently turning her over. She was alive but barely conscious. Jake quickly retrieved his canteen, cradling her head in one arm as he carefully trickled water between her lips. Bethany's eyelids fluttered as moisture touched her tongue. The world slowly came back into focus, revealing a face framed by a worn leather hat. Blue eyes filled with concern looked down at her, and a strong arm supported her shoulders. "Easy now," the stranger said, his voice low and reassuring. "Don't drink too fast." He helped her sit up slightly, offering the canteen again. "You're safe with me now." Bethany took another small sip, studying the man who had appeared like a mirage in her darkest moment. His face was weathered from years under the sun, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. Despite his rugged appearance, there was a gentleness in the way he held the canteen for her. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "I thought I was going to die out here." "Not while I've got anything to say about it," Jake replied, helping her to a sitting position in the shadow of the wagon. "Name's Jake Reynolds. I've got a cabin about 3 miles east of here." "Bethany Sullivan," she replied, attempting to smooth her disheveled hair. "I was heading to Fort Laramie when my wheel broke. I tried to fix it, but—" She gestured weakly at the splintered wood. Jake examined the damage with a practiced eye. "That wheel won't be rolling again. You've been out here alone. Where's your husband?" His eyes flicked to the simple gold band on her finger. Bethany's gaze dropped to her hands. "Dead. Fever took him last winter in Kansas." She didn't mention how Thomas had insisted on building their homestead near a swamp, ignoring warnings about disease. His stubbornness had cost him his life and her everything they'd built together. Jake nodded, not pressing further. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Sullivan. Night's coming soon and you're in no condition to travel. I propose we make camp here, and come morning, I'll help salvage what we can from your wagon and take you to my place. From there, we can figure out your next steps." Bethany wanted to protest, to insist she could manage on her own as she had for months, but the reality of her situation was undeniable. She was miles from civilization with no transportation, little water, and dwindling supplies. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Reynolds," she finally said. "Jake," he corrected with a small smile. "Out here, formalities don't mean much." As dusk fell, Jake efficiently set up a small camp. He built a fire, prepared a simple meal of beans and jerky, and even managed to fashion a makeshift tent for Bethany using canvas from her wagon. She watched him work, impressed by his calm competence. "Have you lived out here long?" she asked as they sat by the fire, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Jake nodded, sipping his coffee. "Going on 8 years now, came west after the war." He didn't elaborate on which side he'd fought for, and Bethany didn't ask. Too many families had been torn apart by those divisions. "And you live alone?" she ventured, immediately regretting the question as it seemed too forward. If Jake was bothered, he didn't show it. "Just me and my horses. I break Mustangs for the Army and local ranchers. It's a good life, quiet but honest." Bethany nodded, thinking of the noisy boarding house in St. Louis where she'd briefly stayed after Thomas died. The thought of quiet appealed to her more than she could express. "What were your plans?" Jake asked. "Fort Laramie isn't exactly known for its opportunities for a woman on her own." Bethany stared into the fire. "My cousin lives near there. She wrote after Thomas died, offered me a place to stay until I could get on my feet." She didn't mention that the cousin was a virtual stranger, someone she hadn't seen since childhood. It had simply been her only option. Jake considered this information. "The fort's still a good 4 days' journey from here, and that's with a proper wagon." He poked at the fire with a stick. "My offer stands. You can rest at my place for a few days, regain your strength. Then I can take you to the fort myself." The kindness of this stranger overwhelmed Bethany. She'd encountered too many men since Thomas's death who saw a widow as easy prey. "Why would you do that for someone you don't even know?" Jake's eyes reflected the firelight as he looked at her. "Because 8 years ago I was the one collapsed in the dirt, and someone showed me kindness when they didn't have to. Out here, that's how we survive." Morning brought a clear sky and renewed energy for Bethany. She insisted on helping Jake transfer her belongings to his horse and a travois he constructed from wagon parts. They worked side by side, and Bethany found herself studying Jake when he wasn't looking, the way his hands moved confidently over knots and tools, the quiet concentration in his eyes. "That should do it," Jake finally announced, securing the last bundle. "We'll have to travel slow, but we should reach my place by midday." The journey was indeed slow, with Jake leading his horse while Bethany rode. Despite her protests that she could walk, Jake had insisted, pointing out that she was still recovering from heat exhaustion. The landscape gradually changed, with more trees appearing as they headed east toward the foothills. "There it is," Jake said eventually, pointing ahead to a clearing where a sturdy log cabin stood. A corral containing several horses adjoined it, and a small creek ran nearby. It was simple but well maintained, with smoke rising from the stone chimney. Bethany frowned. "Is someone there?" "That'll be Jim Hawkins. He watches the place when I'm gone more than a day or two." Jake helped her dismount as an older man with a white beard emerged from the cabin. "Brought company, I see," Jim called out, his eyes curious but not unfriendly as they fell on Bethany. "Mrs. Sullivan's wagon broke down out west," Jake explained. "She'll be staying until she's well enough to continue to Fort Laramie." Jim nodded, tipping his hat to Bethany. "Madam, Jake's place ain't fancy, but it's solid. I've got stew on the stove. I'll be heading back to my own place now that you're here." After Jim departed, Jake showed Bethany inside. The cabin was indeed simple, one main room with a stone fireplace, a table with chairs, and a few shelves holding books that surprised Bethany with their variety. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom. "You can take the bed," Jake said, noticing her gaze. "I'll use my bedroll by the fire." "I couldn't possibly," Bethany began, but Jake cut her off gently. "I insist. You need proper rest." His tone made it clear the matter wasn't up for debate. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Bethany, determined not to be a burden, took over cooking and mending some of Jake's clothes that needed attention. Jake continued his work with the horses, though he stayed closer to the cabin than usual. On the third evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Bethany finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "How did you end up here, Jake? You don't seem like most cowboys I've met." Jake was silent for so long that Bethany thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet against the chirping of crickets. "I was a captain in the Union Army. After Appomattox, I couldn't go home to Pennsylvania. Too many ghosts." He stared at the horizon. "I drifted west, did some scouting for the Army. Found I had a way with horses that no one had ever bothered to notice before. When I came across this land, something just felt right. Like I could breathe again for the first time in years." Bethany nodded, understanding completely. "Thomas and I came west for a fresh start, too. He had big dreams, my husband. Too big, maybe," she sighed. "He never listened to advice, always thought he knew better. Even when the local doctor warned about the swamp." "Some men can't bend," Jake observed. "It breaks them instead." "Yes," Bethany whispered, surprised at how accurately he'd captured Thomas's fatal flaw. "And then I was alone." "You're not alone right now," Jake said simply. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Bethany looked away first, her heart beating faster than it had in a very long time. The next morning, Bethany awoke to the sound of raised voices outside. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Jake confronting three rough-looking men on horseback. "Like I said, Carson, I haven't seen your cattle," Jake was saying, his stance casual but alert. "And even if I had, this is open range. Your brand doesn't mean much this far east." The largest of the men, evidently Carson, scowled. "Those beeves cost me good money, Reynolds. And it's mighty suspicious they vanish right near your property." "Perhaps you should hire better cowhands," Jake suggested, his voice level but with an edge that made Bethany shiver. Carson's eyes shifted to Bethany, his expression changing to one of unpleasant interest. "Well now, what do we have here? Found yourself some company, Reynolds. Didn't know you were in the market for a woman." Bethany stiffened, but before she could speak, Jake stepped between her and Carson's gaze. "Mrs. Sullivan is a widow traveling to Fort Laramie. Her wagon broke down, and she's recuperating here. She's under my protection, Carson, and I'd advise you to remember your manners." Carson's eyes narrowed, but something in Jake's steady gaze made him reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. Instead, he spat on the ground and jerked his head at his companions. "We'll be moving on, but this cattle business ain't settled, Reynolds." The three men rode off, dust billowing behind them. "Who were they?" Bethany asked as Jake turned back to her. "Blake Carson owns the biggest ranch west of here. He's been trying to push out smaller operations for years." Jake's expression was grim. "He's not used to being told no." "Is he dangerous?" Jake considered the question. "He prefers intimidation to outright violence, but yes, he can be dangerous. Don't worry, though. He won't bother us here." Despite Jake's reassurance, Bethany noticed he kept his rifle closer at hand over the next few days. She also couldn't help but observe that he hadn't corrected Carson's insinuation about her presence. The thought brought color to her cheeks whenever she remembered it. A week passed, then another. Bethany knew she should press on to Fort Laramie, but each day she found another reason to stay. She told herself, It was practical. She was helping Jake with chores he'd neglected, organizing his books, improving his sparse furnishings with items from her wagon. But in quiet moments, she admitted the truth. She was reluctant to leave Jake Reynolds and the peace she'd found in his simple cabin. For his part, Jake never mentioned her departure. They fell into a comfortable routine, working side by side during the day and talking by the fire in the evenings. Jake taught her about the horses, and Bethany shared stories of her childhood in Ohio. They carefully avoided discussing the future. One evening, as summer began its transition to fall, Jake returned from town with supplies and a letter. "It's for you," he said, handing it to Bethany. "Your cousin must have heard about your wagon from travelers. She sent it to the general store in case you pass through." Bethany opened the letter with trembling fingers. As she read, her expression fell. "My cousin's husband has taken a position in California. They left Fort Laramie 3 weeks ago." She lowered the letter. "She apologizes for not being able to wait longer." Jake watched her carefully. "What will you do now?" It was the question they'd both been avoiding. Bethany folded the letter, considering her options. They were painfully few. She could try to find work in town, perhaps as a teacher or a seamstress. She could continue to Fort Laramie anyway and hope to find some opportunity there. Or, "I don't know," she admitted. "I have some savings, but not enough to establish myself properly anywhere." Jake was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hesitant, unlike his usual confidence. "You could stay here, if you wanted to, that is." Bethany looked up sharply. "Stay as what, your housekeeper?" A flush crept up Jake's neck. "No, that's not what I meant." He stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace. "Forget I said anything. It was presumptuous." Bethany rose as well, her heart pounding. "Jake, what did you mean?" He turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I meant that these weeks with you have been the best I've had in years, maybe ever. The cabin feels like a home now, not just a place I sleep." He took a deep breath. "I'm saying I care for you, Bethany, more than I thought possible." Bethany's breath caught. The truth was, she felt the same way. The quiet cowboy with gentle hands and thoughtful words had awakened feelings she'd thought died with Thomas. But fear held her back. "Jake, I'm still mourning Thomas, and you barely know me." Jake stepped closer. "I know you're strong enough to cross half the country alone. I know you're kind enough to mend a stranger's shirts without being asked. I know you laugh at the same passages in Twain that I do." His eyes held hers. "And I know that when you look at me sometimes, you feel what I'm feeling right now." Bethany couldn't deny it. The attraction between them had been building steadily, a warm current beneath their everyday interactions. But was it enough to build a life on? Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Jake's expression changed instantly, alert and wary. He moved to the window, peering out into the twilight. "It's Carson with 5 men this time." Jake reached for his rifle. "Stay inside, Bethany." But Bethany had already glimpsed the men through the window, and what she saw chilled her. "They're carrying torches, Jake." Carson's voice boomed across the yard. "Reynolds, get out here and face what's coming to you." Jake checked his rifle, his face grim. "Stay back from the windows." He moved to the door, opening it just enough to call out. "What do you want, Carson?" "Found 3 of my cattle with their brands altered," Carson shouted. "Only one man around here who dare do that. I'm not a rustler, Carson, never have been. We'll let the circuit judge decide that, if you make it to him alive." Carson's men laughed, an ugly sound in the gathering darkness. Jake turned to Bethany, his expression grave. "There's a trapdoor under the rug by the bed. It leads to a root cellar. Get down there and stay quiet." Bethany shook her head fiercely. "I'm not hiding while you face 6 armed men alone. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight when they threatened you." Bethany moved to the cabinet where she knew Jake kept a shotgun. "I can shoot." Thomas made sure of that. Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but another shout from outside interrupted him. "We're coming in, Reynolds." Last chance to come out peaceful like. Jake's jaw tightened. "Back door," he whispered to Bethany. "Circle around to the corral. If they start shooting, use the horses for cover." They slipped out the back just as the front door crashed open. Jake led the way through the shadows to the corral where the horses were restless, sensing the tension. From this position, they could see Carson and his men spreading out around the cabin. "He ain't here." One of the men called from inside. "Check the barn," Carson ordered. "And someone start a fire. Let's smoke him out if we have to." Jake's expression hardened as one of Carson's men approached the woodpile with a torch. "That's it," he muttered, raising his rifle. "Wait," Bethany whispered. "Look." In the distance, the unmistakable outlines of horsemen appeared, moving fast toward the cabin. As they drew closer, Bethany could make out the glint of badges on several chests. "The marshal," Jake breathed. "But how?" "Jim," Bethany realized. "He must have seen them passing his place." Indeed, Jim Hawkins rode beside Marshal Davis and 3 deputies as they thundered into the yard. Carson and his men froze, caught completely off guard. "Drop those weapons," Marshal Davis bellowed. "Unless you want to spend the next decade in territorial prison." What followed was a tense standoff that ended with Carson and his men reluctantly surrendering their guns. As Jake and Bethany emerged from the shadows, the marshal explained that Jim had spotted Carson's gang heading toward Jake's with obvious ill intent and had ridden straight to town for help. "Lucky thing I was already investigating Carson," the marshal added. "Got reports of altered brands from 3 different ranchers. Found evidence at his place this morning, but he'd already lit out." He gave Jake a measured look. "You two all right?" "We're fine," Jake assured him. "Though I think I owe Jim a drink or 3 next time I'm in town." After the marshal departed with his prisoners, promising to return the next day for statements, Jake and Bethany found themselves alone again in the cabin. The interrupted moment from earlier hung between them, weighted with new significance after the night's danger. "I thought I might lose you," Bethany said quietly, breaking the silence. "When I saw all those men, I realized what that would mean to me now." Jake crossed the room to stand before her. "And what would it mean, Bethany?" She looked up at him, the fear of earlier replaced by certainty. "It would mean losing the future I've started to imagine, a future here with you." Jake's hands came up to frame her face gently. "Is that what you want?" "A future with a simple horse trainer in a cabin that's too small and too far from town." Bethany smiled, covering his hands with her own. "It's not too small, and the company more than makes up for the distance to town." Jake's smile matched hers as he lowered his head. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a demand. When they separated, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Bethany Sullivan. I think I have since I found you by that broken wagon. And I love you, Jake Reynolds, though I'll admit it took me a little longer to realize it." Their second kiss held all the passion they'd kept restrained for weeks. When they finally parted, breathless, Jake took her hands in his. "Marry me, Bethany. Not because you need a place to stay or protection, but because we could build something good together." "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jake Reynolds." They were wed 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with Jim Hawkins standing as Jake's best man and the marshal's wife attending Bethany. The ceremony was simple, but the celebration afterward was not, as it seemed the entire community turned out to wish them well. "Never thought I'd see the day Jake Reynolds took a wife," the blacksmith commented, raising a glass. "You must be something special, Mrs. Reynolds." Bethany, still getting used to her new name, smiled as she felt Jake's arm tighten around her waist. I'm just fortunate he happened to be tracking horses in the right place at the right time. Wasn't fortune, Jake murmured for her ears alone. Some things are just meant to be. As fall turned to winter, Bethany and Jake settled into married life. The cabin no longer felt small to Bethany, but cozy and warm. Jake added a second room before the first snow, promising more expansions in the spring. With Carson facing trial for rustling and attempted murder, the territory seemed more peaceful than ever. One December evening, as they sat by the fire, Bethany looked up from her sewing with a smile that held a secret. "I've been thinking," she said casually. "We might need to add that third room sooner rather than later." Jake looked up from his book, confusion giving way to understanding as he noted where her hand rested on her still flat stomach. "Bethany, are you saying?" Her smile widened. "Come June, there will be 3 Reynolds living in this cabin." Jake was across the room in an instant, gathering her in his arms with a whoop of joy that startled the cat dozing by the fire. His kiss tasted of happiness and promises kept, of a future neither of them could have imagined when fate brought them together on that dusty plain. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you." "And we love you," Bethany replied, her heart full. From the brink of death beside a broken wagon to this moment of perfect joy, it had been an incredible journey, and it was only beginning. 5 years later, the Reynolds ranch had grown considerably. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and even a small library. The horse business was thriving, with Jake's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spreading throughout the territory. Bethany stood on the porch, watching as Jake taught their 4-year-old son James to ride his new pony. Their 2-year-old daughter, Emma, clutched her mother's skirts, eager for her turn though she could barely walk steadily yet. The child Bethany carried now, due in another month, kicked vigorously as if already impatient to join the family adventures. "Mama, look," James called, beaming with pride as he circled the yard on his patient mount. "I see you, darling. You're doing wonderfully." Bethany called back, her heart swelling with love for her family. As Jake helped James dismount, he looked up and caught Bethany's eye across the yard. The love and gratitude in his gaze still took her breath away, even after all these years. He was no longer the solitary cowboy who had found her collapsed beside her wagon, and she was no longer the desperate widow with nowhere to go. Together, they had built something neither could have imagined alone. "You're safe with me now," he had said on that fateful day. And they all were safe in the love they had found in each other.